And welcome everyone to our closing keynote, our final event over this last 3 days of the University of Maryland Disability Summit 2021. So it is my absolute pleasure to be welcoming you all here today after a lot of wonderful presentations. I am the moderator and that is in my title, so please ask questions as we'll have a Q&A following the presentation. My name is Stephanie Cork, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am wearing some sort of tie-dye-ish top, very professional looking with some pandemic hair happening. I'm a white woman, and we would like to invite you to tweet the happenings of our summit using the hashtags disabilities at UMD, hashtag 2021 Disability Summit, and we have a Twitter profile, so if you'd like to follow us, please do, at UMD Disability S1. So just to inform you, this session is being recorded, and pursuant to Maryland law, we are providing verbal and visual notification of the recording. That means if you continue to participate, your consent to the recording is implied. Accessibility services for this session include both American Sign Language interpretation and Certified Deaf interpretation, or ASL and CDI. And that video will be displayed during the entire session. Attendees can pin videos or remove interpreters from the screen as desired. For a better view and experience, we recommend you use a desktop device versus the mobile app. CART service can be enabled by selecting the closed captioning feature located at the bottom bar in the Zoom webinar to enable live caption within Zoom, or you can use your own device by selecting the link in the chat. So please post all questions to the chat. We will select a representative sample of questions for the presenters to answer in order to conserve time. Now, before we get started, I want to hand it over to DRC Neal, who is going to be talking about our wonderful keynote speaker. DRC is currently pursuing his PhD at Ohio State University. He is a celebrated audio narratologist and award-winning scholar and storyteller who will be using his talents to introduce our closing keynote speaker. So I'll hand it over to DRC. You're muted.
Sorry, I just realized that. I was like, oh no, I'm muted. I was saying thank you so much for allowing me to be here. It is such an honor to be back among all the Terps. It's been a couple of years, but I miss Maryland very dearly. My name is DRC Charrington Neal, and I am a dark-skinned Black man with blonde dreads pulled back, and I'm wearing a dark blue shirt with some very sparkly silver sequins down the front in the shape of a flag. And so, yeah, my job here today is to introduce Dr. Angel Love Miles. And I just have to start this introduction by saying, this is a very surreal feeling for me to know that I get to introduce my friend, my mentor, and the person responsible for the reason that I myself, 14 years after we met, am doing a PhD is incredible. I'll be honest, anytime I see a young Black disabled person anywhere is a moment of miniature celebration, because the media, film, books, and various disability organizations will have you believing that Black disabled people exist as a kind of phantom conjuration made of the kind of magic that comes straight from Harry Potter. In some ways, you can say that that's true, since Blackness existing openly anywhere in the space of white supremacy does so partially in the realm of the unreal. And so to see it projected with so much power and radiance the way that Angel does is on a completely different level. I come from North Carolina, from cities and towns where Black people in wheelchairs belong to the projects, the shelters, or the Veterans Administration. And there was very little open space in my imagination to consider my own body as a Black queer boy growing up with cerebral palsy for anything else. But after meeting Angel, after she studied abroad in Australia, or knowing that she'd participated in an international disability cultural exchange in Tokyo, Japan, and then later convinced me to do my own in San Juan, Costa Rica, I can tell you all that there is nothing imaginary about her. Dr. Angel Love Miles holds an undergrad degree from Penn State University and a PhD in women's studies through the University of Maryland at College Park. She was born with spina bifida and raised in a predominantly Black housing complex for low-income families in Germantown, Pennsylvania. She grew up playing with the neighborhood children, but attended separate schools and camps for children with disabilities. Influenced by her upbringing, she soon developed an interest in exploring issues of identity and inequality as they pertain to intersecting structures of race, class, gender, and of course, disability. Her dissertation, named Barriers and Facilitators to Home Ownerships for African American Women with Physical Disabilities, highlighted how education, economics, architecture, and discrimination, combined with personal issues of identity and self-esteem, all create barriers to home ownership. For the University of Maryland, or for any school in the United States, where disabled people of color make up a tenth of a tenth of a tenth of the students, it was a landmark moment and a boss move to highlight the disparities of multi-marginalized people who actually know what the hell they're talking about. And better yet, as a doctor, nowadays you have to pay her for it. When she left my doorstep the first time after we met, when I was just starting my own path of Black excellence as an intern for NASA Goddard, I remember being completely in awe. Growing up Black and disabled, you learn that such dreams can be deferred, as Langston Hughes puts it. They can be blocked, pushed, silenced, and snuffed out. But here was someone who was literally in the space that I'd only ever imagined in my dreams. And now, as a PhD student in the #1 ranked English school in America, Angel has become the foundation for my own work on what I call Afrophantasm, or how to be Black, disabled, and completely badass. After completing her postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Disability and Human Development and the Department of Occupational Therapy in the College of Applied Health Sciences at the University of Illinois at Chicago, she became the Healthcare and Home Community-Based Services Policy Analyst at a prominent disability rights and advocacy organization that is also based in Chicago. And today, she has become the personification of Black girl magic. And so with all of that said, it is now my absolute honor and privilege to welcome my friend, Dr. Angel Love Miles.
Wow, I can't even handle that. I'm gonna cry and be a mess for the rest of this talk, so I'm trying to compose myself. Thank you so much, DRC. That means so much more than you could ever know. When I started doing my work, exploring issues impacting Black people with disabilities, more than anything, I wanted to make sure that what I did reflected our lives and that it was something that other Black disabled people can be proud of and could see themselves in. And so to hear, to be affirmed in that way by you, not only my friend, but it's someone else who is multiply marginalized as a Black queer man with a disability, just means more than you can ever know, more affirming than any award or publication I've ever received. So thank you so much. So with that said, before I completely turn into mush, as the RC said, my name is Dr. Angel Love Miles, and I'm so thrilled to be here. I am a Black woman with short locks, and I'm wearing glasses with brown skin, and I am wearing a shirt that is meaningful for this talk, and it basically says, imagine a whole ass system telling you no, but you still killing it. So again, it says, imagine a whole ass system telling you no, but you still killing it, which is basically in part what my presentation will be about today when I talk about demystifying the overcoming narrative of Black disabled women's road to the professorate. So first, oh, I also wanted to say that my pronouns are she and her. I almost forgot about it. And so I want to thank also not only DRC, but thank all the organizers, including Stephanie, Paul, and all the people who funded and sponsored the Disability Summit at the University of Maryland. I'm just so thrilled to be here, and it's such a surreal feeling to be back at my alma mater, even if it's virtually. It's such a full circle moment, and I feel really privileged to have been asked to come. And I, completed my dissertation just 4 years ago on the facilitators of homeownership for Black women with disabilities, with physical disabilities. And I want to shout out my dissertation members, Dr. Robert McGraw at GW, and Lynn Bowles and Debbie Rosenfeld, who were in the Department of Women's Studies at the time, and also Chris Marsh in sociology, and of course my advisor, Dr. Bonnie Thornton Dill and Dean, for being part of that process. So now that I'm a few years distant from that experience, I really want to share some reflections on my life and that journey that I took to get to where I am now in my career as a proud, disabled Black woman scholar activist. And I also just want to share, how I still continue to wrestle with the intersections of anti-Blackness and ableism and misogyny, even as I've accomplished these goals. So DRC sharing how getting to know me influenced his journey really got me thinking about the importance of disability community, especially among multiply marginalized people, and of representation, which is what motivated me to share more about how I got to where I am today. However, I really had some serious apprehension about sharing any part of my personal history. Besides the reality that I'm African American, and in our culture, you're not supposed to tell your business. Beyond that, there's also the reality that disability narratives are often weaponized against people with disabilities in multiple ways, including reducing our complex and nuanced stories as objects of pity and inspiration, for the sole purposes of affirming the value of non-disabled people's lives, at the expense of recognizing the value of disabled lives. And also to motivate the interests of researchers, policymakers, and others who control or often misinterpret our personal stories based on their terms and not based on ours. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to be a researcher, is because I wanted to challenge the way research has often been used to harm marginalized communities, including people with disabilities and people of color and women of color with disabilities. The dominant view about disabled lives remains the misguided belief that ours are inherently unpleasant and less favorable to disabled ones. Okay, I'm sorry, I was reading the text. I thought I was getting a message online. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is reinforce that idea by telling you about my struggles with adversity and how I overcame them, right? So people with disabilities are also far from the only group treated as objects of pity or inspiration for the gain of other groups in power. We see this in media depictions of the stories of Black people and other people of color all the time. In movies like, say, The Blind Side, where the true story of a talented Black male athlete was reduced to a white savior and magical Negro narrative. Or in practically every other episode of Ellen, where she is rewarding some poor disadvantaged person, often a person of color, who has endured hardship without demanding that her audience, the government, or society at large do anything significant to redress the inequities that often lead to their disadvantages, beside the ever elusive, be kind, and which is strategically followed by product placement, of course. Aging people are also treated as objects of inspiration and pity to uphold younger people's sense of self and purpose. And what's interesting is that as much as America loves a feel-good story about Black, disabled, aging, and otherwise disadvantaged people, it's puzzling that such a large segment of our national leadership and population remains uninspired enough to make the social and political changes needed to reduce COVID-19 infection and deaths, which are disproportionately impacting those very groups. And one of the reasons is because dominant constructions of overcoming narratives tend not to be about serving the interests of marginalized people that they are about, but about reinforcing dominated narratives that justify inequality. So, but more on that a little bit later. So in the case of people with disabilities, the problem with the inspiration overcoming trope is in some that it tends to blame disabled people's oppression on individuals' bad attitude or lack of effort towards rehabilitating or curing their disability. So if you just, there's the saying that you might see in memes, it says like attitude, the real disability, as if like thinking positive is gonna really change the fact that, your school is inaccessible, or you can't get sign language interpreting at your doctor's office, even though you've requested it long ago. So, the last thing I want is for people to believe that other people with disabilities are lazy or lack motivation just because I've accomplished something that society values and most have not received the opportunity to achieve, which is the PhD. The fact that there are so few Black disabled women PhDs says more about how solidified systems of inequality are than it does about the rigor of my program or my personal will or determination, even though I do have that as well. The other problem with dominant constructions of overcoming narratives is that they tend to ignore systemic ableism's contributions to inequitable outcomes based on ability. And they tend to reward people with disabilities for transcending barriers without acknowledging that the barriers themselves are unjust or without working to remove them. So marginalized people should not have to exert extraordinary amounts of effort and strength in order to achieve the same things as people without those marginalized identities. This belief normalizes oppressive structures and suggests that they are good for you. Think of all the ways that the energy that marginalized people exert towards, overcoming oppression could be used in more useful ways. Think of how much more people who beat the odds would have been able to accomplish if there were no odds to beat. Let's focus on what we can do to make the road to stories like mine less extraordinary and less difficult for someone else to achieve. Now, that being said, my disclaimer, I want to emphasize that there's nothing wrong with being inspired, encouraged, or moved by someone's story. I hope that I do that today, as DRC is product of a person who was moved by my story so far. But I hope I do that today, but not in ways that reinforce the belief that disabled lives are somehow less worth living, and not in ways that don't demand you to question the pervasiveness of that assumption in society. So in sharing my story, I want to challenge the idea that adversity of any kind, much less systemic oppression, is mystically or incomprehensibly overcome or transcended, Black girl magic notwithstanding. The barriers marginalized people face on the road to their dreams are managed, negotiated, and resisted in various ways. Sometimes the management of these barriers is conscious, other times through muscle memory, but it cannot be stressed enough that successful maneuvering through systemic oppression takes skill and comes from a lot of practice, which is not always a good thing, as practice often means we've encountered this very oppressive situation many times before and finally found a way around it. It is essential that we demystifies the overcoming process by identifying the tools and strategies used to manage barriers and making them known so that they can be replicated and perfected in order to help clear the path for others. By sharing this narrative, that is what I intend to do. It is so important that we resist the temptation of dominant groups to reward our exceptional achievements by propping us up as individuals in ways that push others who are also a part of our communities down. I see a lot of people with disabilities, for example, embracing dominant inspirational narratives, internalizing it or monetizing it even. And I get it, right? It feels good. You get a lot of attention from it. I know I did when I was a kid and I was a poster child for the March of Dimes. But it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost to your sense of self and to our sense of community, right? And the idea of like collective progress rather than individual success. Finally, I want to express that we do not manage through adversity alone. There is often a social and emotional cost to all of this overcoming. Every microaggression left unchecked can feel like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Every institutional barrier knocked down leaves an impression and scar on your heart that can easily turn to unchecked bitterness, anger, and resentment towards self through the development of depression or towards others. Anger and resentment about injustice is okay. In fact, it is necessary in order to not internalize it. But it's best to find ways to use those justifiable emotions without letting them use you. My goal is for my pain to have purpose and to work towards being better, not consistently bitter to the point that I lose sight of who I am and the agency that I do have, even in the midst of great injustice. I work hard to make sure that my justified anger and resentment towards oppression do not turn into feelings of worthlessness about myself or turn into a lifestyle of victimhood and learned helplessness. I live with constant rage from encountering and witnessing multiple injustices in my life and the life of others like me every day, such as through the high rates and death of people with disabilities in nursing home and long-term care facilities that are unjustifiable and preventable, or the unjust and persistent killing of Black people by the police. But I also work hard to harness that rage and aim and direct it towards achieving excellence and towards advocating for myself and others by holding systems accountable. I came to a conclusion a long time ago that if I'm going to have to endure racism, sexism, ableism, classism, eventually ageism, and possibly others, then I need to make it count. One of the things that is often left out of dominant overcoming narratives, especially the ones about disability, are the ways that people usually had extraordinary advantages even within their disadvantages. Many of the people that we consider leading founders of the disability rights movement, for instance, had some combination of race, class, gender, sexuality, and educational privileges that helped to prepare them to organize and access the people and resources needed to be heard, even when enduring profound ableism. My story is similarly so. I like to think I had access to just enough oppression and advantage to propel me in the direction toward success. Well, I could sit here and play violins about how I grew up in subsidized housing in an inner city community plagued with drug addiction and violence, which is true, or how I attended schools for children with disabilities, which minimally prepared me for college, which is also true. I'd also be omitting that both of my maternal grandparents had master's degrees, that my uncle had a doctorate by the time I was 8 years old, and that I watched my mother work towards finishing her college degree when I was a little girl. And although the pressure of life, work, and motherhood did not have my mother complete past her junior year, watching her study at night after work all day and after feeding us put an impression on me at an early age about work ethic. She shared what she was learning in class and took me with her to the classes she took. I was sold on college before college even knew I was coming. So I come from a family that very much valued higher education, and I am not a first generation college student. In fact, I would be a third generation. So that is a privilege that I have, even in the context of my other class, race, and gender disadvantages. I could stress that I endured a lot of painful surgeries and share all the struggles related to those and rehab, which is also true, and those should be shared. But I also had access to private and public health insurance and received access to some of the best care that is not available to most other people with disabilities in the world. So these advantages do not minimize the very real barriers I experienced as a Black disabled woman in America from a low-income family, but they do put them in an intersectional context so that we can have a comprehensive understanding of the factors that can propel some people to success. Inspirational narratives often simplify positive social outcomes as a result of individual effort and positive qualities rather than an interaction of a network of social factors working for and against someone and the ways in which they manage them with help. And that's what I intend to emphasize in sharing my story, that I had multiple factors that led to my success. However, even though I had a family that loved me and valued education, that did not guarantee that I would love myself too, or believe that I could accomplish my dreams, as there were also other messages that I received in the world. So the primary barrier I would say that I had to confront on my journey from Philly to the PhD was how to manage my interaction with self as a Black woman with a disability as I interacted with the rest of the world. The first time I can remember having to manage how I perceived myself with how others perceived me was when I was introduced to the stigma of disability as a child. I was about 5 years old and I went outside my house to play. At the nearby playground, a neighborhood kid asked, "What's wrong with you?" To which I replied, "Nothing's wrong with me. What's wrong with you?" He said, No. Why do you walk like that? Are you bow-legged?" And then he pointed to my legs, and I was walking with my crutches at the time. So I replied, "This is just the way I walk." But he suggested that I was supposed to walk more like the way that he did, and he wanted to know why I didn't. And I said, "I didn't know why, but let me go ask my mom." "Mommy!" And so I took my little crutches and I ran to my mom and I was like, hey mom, this kid is asking what happened to me. So like, what happened to me? And she said, well, nothing. You were born this way. And I was like, oh, okay. So then I ran out the house and I ran back on my crutches and I went back to the little boy and I said, hey, my mom says nothing happened to me. I was just born this way. But then he asked again, why? Why were you born that way? So I was like, well, I mean, I don't know. So I got on my took my little crutches and I ran back and to my mom and I was like, mom, this little boy was asking me like, why was I born this way? And my mom said, tell him that that's the way God wanted you to be. And so I was like, oh, okay. So then I took my little crutches and I ran back down the street and I said, my mom says I was born this way because that's the way God wanted me to be, and there's nothing wrong with me. And, that as far as that was concerned, that was that. Except, that wasn't that. Not by a long shot. For the rest of my childhood, every time I went outside, a kid would ask me, sometimes in the cruelest way, hey, what happened to you? What's wrong with her? Don't play with her. Something's wrong with her. She can't play with us. My peers and other Black children in my neighborhood largely rejected me, and it really hurt. And I had to fight really hard to be included. And so I received a message very early on that there was something wrong with me. I also received messages from my school that something was wrong with me, because I attended a school for children with disabilities, first Easter Seals and then Widener in Philadelphia, and I really loved my school. But despite how much support I received there, just by being separated by the other non-disabled children in my life, I received the message that I wasn't good enough to be educated with them or to interact with other children without disabilities. Now, that's not something that was ever really explicitly said, but they also never told us why we were at that school and not at another school. So, we just, myself and the other children with disabilities came to that conclusion for ourselves that we're not with them because there must be something wrong with us and we're just not as good as they are. Everything else in the world suggested that, so that must have been the case. I also received messages from the media that there was something wrong with being poor, with being Black, but especially with being poor and Black. I rarely saw any images of neighborhoods like mine on TV, and when I did, it was on the news for some traumatic event. Even watching Oprah, I received the impression that the only people that mattered had houses, cars, and lived in the suburbs. So something was wrong with me because I was Black, I wasn't middle class, and I was reliant on public transportation. At least that was the message I received if I watched TV. Something was also wrong with my hair. I learned that very early on as a Black girl in Philly. Something was wrong because it wasn't straight, and I struggled with that consistently. I did not see a difference between medical treatment and Black hair care. They were both something that needed to be fixed. I needed leg braces. I needed my legs to be corrected. I needed the hot comb. I needed the perm. My hair had to be straight for me to maneuver in the world successfully the same way my legs did. I noticed I was teased less and called pretty when my hair was straight. In a racist, ableist, misogynist, and otherwise oppressive society, I constantly got the message that I was not enough, that something about me was wrong and needed to be corrected. And in spite the messages of love that I often got from my family and those who knew me, I sometimes internalized that, and I did bring that with me when I went into college and when I went into grad school. But I didn't have any control over, what people thought about me. And my grandparents often told me to focus on what I could do, not what I couldn't. I soon learned that what I could do was school. So I was good at that and I loved it. It helped me balance the negative attention I'd receive for being different. I, like many other marginalized people with higher degrees, managed their adversity by putting their nose in a book. And I was privileged to be able to. I did not have a cognitive or behavioral difficulties that made it more difficult for people with other types of disability to conform to classroom norms or synthesize and digest information. I did not have the type of disability that attracted negative attention from teachers or that was difficult to accommodate. And I, for the most part, lived in an environment where my parents were literate and could help harness that skill. So with that in mind, and that background, you might be wondering more about, what does it take for marginalized people to transcend systemic oppression, given all these issues that I encountered? Based on my experience, I can say that, for example, by senior year of high school, I was ready to go visit the top college of interest, which was Penn State University. But the problem was that it was 4 hours away from my family. And my family did not own a car. If it wasn't for the ride that I received from my favorite teacher, a Black woman named Mrs. Brown, who took me and my mother there and back without asking for money, for gas or anything, I would have never visited or eventually attended Penn State University. Thus, it often takes the commitment of service providers and educators to go far and beyond their job description in order for marginalized people to overcome barriers and achieve extraordinary things. And this is something that I experienced a lot. I needed help, and I needed more than what was legally required in order to get that help, more than just the run-of-the-mill ADA compliance. I needed support, and I needed faculty that really cared about me. So the success of marginalized people depends on their ability, the ability of our mentors to believe and invest in our potential despite the odds and the messages in our culture suggesting otherwise. It took a Latina graduate teaching assistant named Ilse Irizarry to see past my GPA and presence in her remedial English class. She did not let that get in the way of not only encouraging me to eventually apply to the Ronald E. McNair Scholars Program, but she also helped me with my application. This is the program that introduced me and prepared me for graduate school. It also took a mentor in the Student Support Services program by the name of Dr. Audrey Kareem, a Black woman from Philadelphia like me, to introduce me to the study abroad opportunities and to see me as someone who can thrive in such a program. Dr. Kareem's support and mentorship did not end there. When I was near the end of my dissertation process, Dr. Kareem also worked as my dissertation coach for free while I was at the University of Maryland and she was still at Penn State to help me complete that monumental task. So it takes mentors, especially mentors who disabled, people of color, or otherwise marginalized, to invest and to support marginalized people in order for them to overcome adversity. The road to the PhD for me also took community. When I complained to feminist scholar Dr. Chandra Mahanti about how invisible and marginalized I felt in my women's studies program, even as a Black woman with a disability, she reminded me that when she was in grad school, there was no programs or courses focused on women of color. Instead, she and her friends began to search for and create the community and knowledge she wanted to see, and she encouraged me to do the same. This was some of the best advice I've ever received. And so I did that. I sought after CRIP community, especially community with other disabled people like DRC, and I was so thrilled when I saw him on campus. another Black person with a disability, with an apparent disability and physical disability like my own. This community, other communities, other minority communities in which I'm a part of, they are what sustained, comforted, and affirmed me. I benefited from the network of friends with disabilities I grew up with also in my childhood and the disabled schools and camps I went to. If I didn't understand a letter I received from Social Security Administration about SSI benefits, I reached out to a friend who received a similar letter and received advice on how she managed it. I learned about the resources that were available to me by listening to my more privileged white disabled friends who received opportunities and services I did not know were available to me. Because of the well-documented implicit and explicit racial biases in rehabilitation counselors and other disability service providers, resources and information are often hoarded from disabled people of color. I did not know that vocational rehabilitation could provide me with my own computer for college, for example. I bought mine with a credit card. I did not know that I could receive home and community-based personal care assistance paid by the state. I relied on close friends and informal networks with non-disabled people for most of my direct support needs during college and graduate school, until a white friend with a disability told me who did her nails, a paid PA who was paid by the state. It also, my success also took the creation and investment of systems which were deliberately designed to combat inequality. Programs like the Maryland AGAP Promise program, which was funded by the National Science Foundation to support doctoral students of color through the professorate. This program provided seminars that demystify the graduate school culture and expectation, grant writing seminars, seminars about the academic job market, and dissertation writing, to name a few. It also provided opportunities to socialize and network with other graduate students of color on a predominantly white institution where many of us were disconnected and isolated from each other. And I really hope that that program is still going on at the University of Maryland, and I'm a product of why it's so valuable. Finally, it took asking for help when I needed it. This is something that is hard and continues to be hard for me to do. Graduate school is about demonstrating your competence. The last thing you want to do is admit that you need help with something. I feared asking for help and risking the possibility of reinforcing ideas that Black disabled people and women are incompetent, less prepared, dependent, and weaker than others. I feared reinforcing the idea that I did not belong. But I challenged that fear by putting my needs first and resisting internalized ableism. If someone refused to help me, I asked the next person. If systems or I asked the next person, system, or institution until I got the help I needed and deserved in order to accomplish my goals. These are just a few of the tools in my toolkit that enabled me to accomplish my goal of gaining a PhD as a Black woman with a disability. These are the tools that enabled me to beat the odds against me. For example, while the overall literacy rate for persons with disability in the in the world is 3%, according to the US Agency on International Development, it is even less for women with disabilities at 1%. In addition, only 2% of the world and 1.2% of Americans even has a PhD. And somehow, remarkably, I've been able to beat those odds. And, but I really want that to change. I have no desire to be an anomaly. And so I want you to think about, what goals do you have? When you tell your narrative about how you survived the COVID-19 pandemic, which is everyone's ultimate goal right now, what will you say? Will you ask for help? Will you go far and beyond your job description to provide help to others? What systems do we need to put in place to enable people to meet not only their needs, but their potential, whatever that is? How can we work harder so that being a disabled Black woman, PhD, is not an anomaly, but an expectation, where the absence of disabled people of color in spaces of power are not the norm, but are considered a problem that is constantly questioned and expected to change? These are the questions I have for you, and that is the work that's left undone. Thank you. And I'm open to any questions that you all may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miles. We already have someone asking, can you repeat your kind of last words? Because those questions I think we want to reflect on, and also are kind of the call to action, if you're up for repeating those for our participants.
Yeah, sure. So what I said is, I want you to think about what goals do you have in your life, you know, even if it's just for today, and then for the long term. And more importantly, when you tell your narrative, when this is all over, and you tell your narrative about how you survived the COVID-19 pandemic, which should be everyone's ultimate goal right now, what will you say? Will you ask for help? Will you go far and beyond your job description to provide help to others? And not just your job description, but what's generally expected of us as members of society. And what systems do we need to put in place to enable people to meet their needs, and also meet their potential, whatever that is? How can we work harder so that being a disabled Black woman PhD, for example, is not an anomaly, but is a expectation, is an ordinary, like, okay, and what? And where the absence, and what do we need to do where the absence of disabled people of color in spaces of power are not the norm, but are considered a problem that is consistently questioned and expected to be resolved? So I just want to live in a world where people aren't shocked that I showed up, you know, but they are actually questioning why there aren't more people like me in boardrooms and in positions of power. That's the world that we want to create. And so I hope that helped. And I can put the questions in the chat if that's also helpful.
I tried to do my best, but if you're willing to verbatim put them in, that'd be phenomenal. And we are recording this session, and so there will be a recording available and for folks after. However, we do have time in this moment to ask questions of Dr. Miles, and thank you really and sincerely for being here today. You were at the very first summit in that basement of Hornbeck when they turned the lights off on us. We didn't have a mic. And now we've grown quite a bit, and that's really thanks to you and our community here today. So
it's also thanks to you. So thanks to all of you. So thank you so much.
Teamwork makes the dream work. That's what I keep saying, because Amanda and Alex and everyone have just been beyond.
It takes a village.
So I may take, Gary Norman, one of our moderators earlier today, took chair privilege of asking the first question, so I may do that. But folks, feel free, you can put your questions, I swear I'll ask them. So my question is, and kind of how you close this out, so your tenacity notwithstanding, because formal networks do fail, and to your point, power hoarding is part of white supremacy culture, what do we need to do to change that? And I mean that we've had a lot of young activists, and we also have allies, accomplices, families, professionals who are here too. So you can speak to either or both of those communities. And then we have, and thank you for posting the questions.
So what can we do to challenge the power hoarding? I mean, one, we need to, recognize that it's happening. A lot of people don't even realize that that's an issue. They just think, well, I just have my friends and I like who I like, and this has no impact on other people. And so, it's really important that we try to be critical thinkers and are constantly thinking about like who's not here. Like for me, I'm always thinking about who's not here. And because I grew up with disabled people, like where it was normal to be disabled, because I went to disabled schools and disabled camps, when I suddenly went and I was mainstreamed, which was supposed to be the dream, right? Inclusive education, but it was also really culturally shocking and hard for me, like at Penn State, where suddenly, I was socialized to be around, majority disabled people most of my life in special education. And then suddenly I was in this overwhelmingly white school that was 40,000 people. When I went to the same school from kindergarten to 12th grade, with just 400 people, and I missed I miss disabled people. Like wherever I am in a space where they're not there, I miss them. I long for them. I have no desire to be, one of the only Black disabled women of color with a PhD. It's lonely, and I can't wait until there's more of us and more people talking about Black disability studies. So then I don't have to anymore, and I can start talking about Netflix or something. Start talking about something else. I have other interests, but until America gets this right, I'm gonna be in your face. So I hope that that helped. But just keep asking who's not here and never being complacent with how or too proud about how diverse your space is. It's never diverse enough. There's always somebody missing. Find them, bring them to the table.
I love that. Find them. There is always somebody missing. And I think that's a perfect way to say it. I think another thing that folks are wondering, you've spoken to, and again, we do have some of the younger kind of disability activists here in the chat. I don't know if you know about the report by Adith, who is at the University of Maryland, or was graduate now, who did a big accessibility report that actually echoes a lot of the work you had already done at Maryland. And so you kind of built this foundation. You were this visible person who fought back. But how do these individuals, as you said, you have other interests, there's other things you want to do. How do you hold space for yourself simultaneously while constantly fighting?
I mean, it's hard. It's something I'm still trying to figure it out, because, you have this big sense of responsibility when you're one of the only ones, when you're a minority. But I think, you just have to, you don't owe anybody anything, first of all, you being you, your presence is enough. So, when I was at Maryland, I did desire to start a student organization for people with disabilities. I really did. But it was just, the idea of doing it was just, for me, it was just overwhelming because there were so few people with disabilities. And it's really hard when you know that if you don't say something or if you don't do something, it's probably not going to be done. Like when you're the one in class and you're always the one that's like, what about disability? What about race? Like, what about this? It's really exhausting. And I just decided that like just my presence at Maryland was enough, and I didn't need to formally create an organization, even though I hope that somebody else does. I decided to let go that sense of responsibility that like I gotta do it because nobody else is gonna do it. I'm like, well, I guess it's just not gonna get done then, like because I'm not doing it. Like I have other things I want to do with my time in my life, and so you get to do that. You get to choose. You don't have to represent all the time. And I did other things, and I just my presence is a protest. I don't have to do anything. I can just be there, and just my presence is challenging white supremacy, ableism, and all of the like. So I don't have to do anything, and if I do something, it's because I choose to and because I want to make a difference, but not because I owe anybody anything. And I hope that other people feel that way. At the same time, that is a kind of a double-edged sword, because I do feel a sense of responsibility in that, I want it's I try to build community for my own self-care, and so I owe myself something. I owe myself a community that, an environment that isn't, to help build an environment that isn't ableist, that isn't racist. I need that to survive, right? And so, if I do reach out to other people who are like me, then that's also part of it. So it's not just to help other people, but there are also selfish motives involved too, which I don't think people want to acknowledge. But I have no problem saying that, like, I need other disabled people to survive. And so when DRC was saying, that I was an example for him, that's great. But like, he is for me too. I need him to be successful. I need him to get a PhD out of selfishness, because I refuse to be out here alone on the island. I need other people to cite and to co-conspire with.
Love that. The presence as you being present as resistance. So I wanted to amplify the fact that Adith brought up the Student Advisory Committee for the President's Commission on Disability Issues, which he helped co-found, is one of the only ones that exists, but it does exist at UMD. So he thought that might be good news for you to hear, and that the Promise AGET programming is still going strong, which is another positive comment. I do. So Dr. Mobley has also asked something. So let's end with this question, and then I'll let you kind of finish off, Dr. Miles. So over the past 3 years, there's been a resurgence, particularly amongst abled institutions, in attention to disability. What do you make of this recent turn? And in these new efforts, what gaps and systems still need addition? What's your dream imagining of what access justice in grad programs will look like in 5 years?
Oh man, it's heavy. Okay. I think, I just think academia has a long way to go. Even as they're bringing these programs, and I'm hopeful about them. I think it's great. But academia is an ableist institution. I mean, it is. It's embedded in the culture. And I really wanted to be a professor, and I haven't completely given that up, but right now I'm not in an academic institution. Just the culture of like publish or perish, for example, is just inherently, so destructive. And just the basing the value of people on the rate in which they produce, and without cultivating the care and supports that enable them to produce, the rugged individualism, the lack of just the complete like withholding of affirmation until you and support until you've accomplished some extraordinary feat, like gotten a big grant or whatever, or award, which is immediately forgotten, because you're only as good as the next thing you're working on. I mean, it is just a lot. And so I would say that, my hope is that as these programs are created, that it's self-reflective, that you don't just, that they don't just analyze ableism as something that's out there, but actually the implication of ableism in the academy. And I think that is really also important in terms of thinking about disability justice, which I feel is being co-opted a lot by the academy, without, the institutions reflecting anything remotely related to the values of disability justice. And so many people just completely misusing the term. I mean, especially in terms of, you know, disability justice, which is focused on highlighting and centering the experiences of multiply marginalized people, particularly Black and Brown and LGBTQ people. Like, they have to be at the center. And, you know, these disability studies programs are still primarily white. They're still, you know, they're often not even led or primarily have people with disabilities in them. And if they do, they're not people, you know, they're some of the most privileged disabled people with some of the least, I guess, severe disabilities, right? So what does that mean, right? So we need to think about even the idea that it's okay to fund and accommodate people with intellectual and developmental disabilities up until 12th grade, but suddenly, like, after that, like, you know, there's no room for them. You know, why can't we have more programs for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in colleges and universities? Who says that you have to have a certain cognitive ability in order to experience college? So we just have a lot of work to do in terms of disability studies in the academy, but I am hopeful and I am excited, because when I started grad school, I mean, people didn't know what I was talking about at all. And now there's more publications and there's about Blackness and disability. I mean, it's just exciting. I'm not the only person talking about it. And I know I never was, but to actually see it happening more in print and online, it's just an exciting time to be alive. So I am hopeful, and I am also critical, because, you know, disabled people have to be at the center, and academia just hasn't done that enough. If anything, academia produces disability. Not only is it not conducive to people with disabilities, but it also produces disability. And we really need to think about that. So
Absolutely.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
my thought.
That's phenomenal. And are you okay with folks contacting you after this to continue the conversation? Because we are over time and I want to ensure our service providers can get to the next thing that they need to do.
Yeah,
Can they
sure.
email you?
Please email me. And I just want to thank, you know, all of you for inviting me and listening to me. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
And thank you so much, Dr. Miles. Like a big virtual hands, like clapping. Thank you, thank you, thank you. No, there was no one better to close this out. And we will ensure that we share your information as we close the event and follow up with participants. So thank you also, everyone, for joining us here. We will be sending out a survey after the fact. I cannot thank our entire team enough. I cannot thank the presenters enough. And really and sincerely, Dr. Miles, this would never have existed without your advocacy. So thank you for being that voice, for being the foundation that we were able to grow this on. There would be no summit without you. So I think that's, hey, it's an understatement, let me tell you. So thank you, thank you. Thank you again to everyone. I'm just gonna say the Trace sponsors were our title sponsors, so they were phenomenal. I'm not going to take up any more time. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for being a part of these past 3 days. And thank you, Dr. Miles, for being here to close us out.
Thank you,
Take care, everyone.
Bye, stay in touch.